The story people remember starts like an action movie: night flight, commandos, a runway in Africa. A rescue so wild it still sounds made up. But that is the end of the heartbeat, not the beginning. The passengers are moved into the transit hall of the old terminal, a place that should have been forgettable architecture. Fluorescent lights, stale air, hard floors, and renovation dust. This is not just about ransom or geopolitics anymore. Now there is selection, sorting, names, faces, and passports. Suddenly these are not background facts, but active risk factors. People who boarded the same plane are no longer the same. The hijackers turn a civilian list into a hierarchy of danger, and the setting makes it even colder. This is still technically airport life, with terminals and announcements. Idi Amin visits often, delivering updates and offering performance of concern. He speaks as if this is all some solvable inconvenience. The violence is not wild and chaotic every second. It is managed, administered, and almost polite in places, which is somehow worse, because the world is beginning to understand. Inside, the hostages are living minute to minute, waiting for information, counting armed men, and watching who gets moved. The terrorists demand $5 million and the release of prisoners. They set a deadline, meet the terms, or hostages begin to die. That deadline is where the surface calm ends. Once a clock is attached to a threat, every action becomes infected. Drinking water becomes something you do while thinking about execution. Trying to sleep becomes a wager on the morning light. Every update from a smiling dictator feels like a prelude to murder. That is where this story really begins. Not with the raid, a routine flight turning into a sealed room where life is gone. From there, the layers only get uglier. The terminal stopped feeling like an airport and became an execution chamber. The people released were gone, and the ones left behind understood. You could hear the math of it in the silence. The old building at Entebbe was hot, stale, and overlit. Sweat dried into shirts and shoes, scraped the concrete. Metal chair legs clicked, then everyone froze like a statue. Even a tiny sound might irritate a man with a rifle. And the sorting made it worse, because it was precise. Passports were checked, names were studied, and nationalities separated. Jewish and Israeli passengers were kept back, while others walked away. That kind of selection does something chemical to a room. It strips the last layer off people until every pocket holds a verdict. Every document became a weapon in that room. The difference between leaving and dying was a line on a passport. One moment was almost absurd in its bureaucratic coldness. An Israeli officer slipped past because he had dual nationality. He lived because paper lied more convincingly than flesh. Right? Beside that luck was the opposite, people who refused to leave. A few non-Israeli hostages chose to remain with the group. Think about that room, the hijackers and the deadline hanging over everyone. Some people crossed back into danger because leaving felt worse than staying. That choice makes history feel like a pulse, hammering in your throat. Then there was the moment that landed like a punch. A Holocaust survivor showed a hijacker the number tattooed on his arm. Not a speech or a debate, just skin as evidence. The reply was defensive, claiming to be an idealist, not a Nazi. As if a different slogan changes the sight of armed men. As if history cares what costume evil wears this week. In that instant, the whole room felt time collapse. The same species of fear and the same administrative violence. People can explain themselves beautifully while doing something monstrous. Outside the terminal, governments were talking, while inside, bodies counted hours. The hijackers threatened to kill the captives on a clean, scheduled threat. It puts murder on a timetable and makes everyone listen to the clock. July 1st approached, then negotiations bought time until July 4th. To diplomats, that sounded like process, but to hostages, it was oxygen. Every extension was both relief and torture at the same time. You get another day to live and another day to imagine the end. Ugandan soldiers were part of the architecture of the threat. The hostages were sitting inside a state whose ruler hosted their captors. That changed the texture of fear for everyone inside. There was no obvious safe edge and no trustworthy uniform. The walls themselves felt compromised by every bootstep. Far away, Israel was doing the thing states always do: argue, negotiate, or strike, trade prisoners, or send commandos. Try one more phone call through men who knew Idi Amin. Anything to pry the captives loose, without blood on the floor. Calls were made, and messages crossed borders. None of that made the hostages safer in the moment. It only deepened the dread as the peaceful options thinned out. The room in Entebbe was filling with that invisible pressure. The kind that builds before glass explodes. Here is where the story stops being about courage in the abstract and turns into paperwork, fuel hoses, and floor plans. And one terrifying question: could any of this physically work because flying commandos over 2,500 miles into Uganda was already insane. Getting them back out was the part that could quietly kill the whole mission. The C-130s could make the trip in, but on the return leg, they needed fuel, and Israel couldn't just magically top them off in midair. If there was no refueling solution, there was no raid. End of fantasy, roll credits. Then a back channel opened, and the Israeli government pulled in the British, specifically Sir Maurice Oldfield, the head of MI6. Oldfield reached out to a long-standing contact in Kenya, Minister of Agriculture, Bruce Mackenzie. That sounds almost absurdly bureaucratic for a mission this dramatic. Not a general, not a war council, a Minister of Agriculture. But this is how some of history's loudest operations survive their quietest bottleneck. Mackenzie got to President Jomo Kenyatta, and suddenly the impossible didn't become easy, but it became real enough to plan around. Kenya would allow Mossad to gather intelligence in country before the operation. More importantly, it would allow the Israeli aircraft to land and refuel in Nairobi, at what is now Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. That single concession did more than solve a fuel problem. It changed the raid from a suicidal gesture into a mission with an exit. A floor plan can tell you where a room is. It can't tell you who stands in the doorway at night, which table has been dragged sideways, or where the gunmen rest their weapons, or how many Ugandan soldiers drift in and out. Those details came from people who had already been inside and lived to leave. From them, Israel learned where the remaining hostages were being held and got more detailed information on the number of terrorists, the kinds of weapons they carried, and the presence of Ugandan troops around the terminal. That mattered because every previous assumption now had to be revised. Once they had that, they did something chillingly methodical. Soldiers and civilians, including some of the very people who built the original structure. They rapidly assembled a partial replica of the terminal. Mali Amungu reportedly dismissed the report as gossip, trash talk, and rumor. That sounds unbelievable until you remember what the claim was. That Israel might send a force all the way to Entebbe, deep into hostile territory, and pull off a rescue under Amin's nose. And then there is the darker twist, according to Amin's son, Jafar Remo. Amin himself may have been informed directly by Lumago after returning from the OEU meeting. If that account is accurate, then the mystery changes shape again. That flips the whole logic of the raid. Up to this point, the biggest threat looked like lack of access, lack of fuel, and lack of intelligence. But now, another layer peels back. The operation also depended on an enemy's cognitive blind spot. Not just what Israel knew, but what Amin could not imagine. The raid was being built not only on logistics and rehearsals, but on the psychological advantage of seeming absurd. By the time the force was assembled, the plan was no longer just brave, it was precise. Around 100 commandos, not counting aircrew, were organized into distinct elements. Brigadier General Dan Shamran would command on the ground overall. Colonel Amy Ailon handled communications and support. The main 29-man assault team, the knife aimed directly at the old terminal, was led by Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu. Their task was brutally simple to describe and almost impossible to execute. Hit the terminal, kill the hijackers, find the hostages in the confusion, and pull them out before Ugandan forces could close the trap. The part people remember is the swagger. Black Mercedes, night landing, commandos pouring out. Like a scene somebody would later swear was too cinematic to be true. But swagger is not motive. Motive is what makes men crawl into a metal tube and fly low over black water, with the fuel gauges becoming a moral argument. Motive is what makes an entire state decide that distance and air defenses, bad maps and diplomatic fallout are still smaller problems than doing nothing. Because doing nothing was not neutral here, that is the key. Once the hijackers had separated Jews and Israelis from everyone else. Once old photographs and older memories started leaking into the room. This stopped being just another hostage crisis with negotiators buying time. For Israel, the situation carried a historical charge that was impossible to ignore. The image was unbearable, armed Europeans and Palestinians sorting Jewish passengers in an African terminal while the world watched procedure unfold. You don't need anyone to say the word out loud. The association is already sitting in the room, heavy as wet concrete. That is why the operation was built with such ferocious commitment, not simply to free captives, but to crush the idea that Israeli citizens could be isolated, catalogued, and left waiting for fate, while their government calculated optics. That mindset also explains the brutality of the time compression once wheels hit the ground. The commandos didn't arrive with the luxury of moral purity. They arrived with seconds. No runway lights, cargo doors already open, engines, heat, darkness, misidentification risk. hostages mixed with gunmen and Ugandan soldiers nearby, and the knowledge that one loud mistake could turn the hall into a slaughter pen. So when a sentry challenged the unexpected black Mercedes, suppressed pistols spoke first. When one rifle cracked unsuppressed, the whole operation effectively lost its invisibility and had to convert instantly from deception to shock. That transition tells you everything about their psychology. They weren't fueled by recklessness. They were fueled by the belief that hesitation would kill more people than aggression. Inside the terminal, motive became even uglier, because this is where rescue collides with fear at point-blank range. Stay down, we are Israeli soldiers. It sounds clear on paper, in a hostage hall full of panic, accents, and bad light, and bodies jerking upright on instinct. Clarity shatters. A 19-year-old stands. And in the split second between recognition and reaction, he is mistaken for the enemy. Another hostage is hit. Another dies in the crossfire. This matters because it strips away the cartoon version of heroism. The rescuers weren't charging forward under some clean emotional banner. They were operating under the most punishing human pressure there is. The need to distinguish innocence from threat. In less time than it takes a frightened person to rise from the floor. Their motive was to save lives. But the mechanism available to them was controlled violence. And controlled violence is still violence. It still mangles intention on contact with reality. Even the decision to destroy the MiGs on the ground points to something deeper than tactical neatness. It came from a specific fear, not just failing tonight, but turning the retreat into a chase, turning rescue into massacre on departure, turning triumph into a smoking runway and dead hostages trapped between states. Same with the refueling plan in Nairobi. Same with the airborne command post circling to monitor the raid. These are not just military details. They are evidence of a national psyche acting under an old lesson. Leave your people at the mercy of others. The bill comes due in bodies. That is why this raid still unsettles people. Not because the motive is hard to understand, but because it is almost too easy to understand. The rescuers were driven by duty, memory, and a refusal to outsource survival. The hijackers were driven by theater, leverage, and cold logic. The logic of turning civilians into bargaining chips. Trapped between those motives were ordinary people on a terminal floor, hearing shouts in two languages, trying to decide their fate, whether the men running toward them were death or deliverance. In that kind of room, history is not abstract. It is breath, concrete, muzzle flash, and one terrible truth. Everybody believes they're acting before it is too late. This is the part where the story stops looking like a rescue movie and starts reading like a forensic report. Because the raid worked, that is the shocking part, the impossible thing actually happened. The hijackers were cut down. The hostages were pulled out. The transport planes were loaded, holding together under insane pressure. From touchdown to takeoff, barely 53 minutes. The assault itself, roughly half an hour. On paper, that is surgical, but in real life it was smoke and broken glass, shouted Hebrew, bodies on tile and people pointing with trembling hands toward one more door that had to be opened. Before anyone could say, the night belonged to the rescuers. Inside the terminal, one hijacker realized the script had flipped. He scrambled for cover in a restroom. Another opened fire and was killed immediately. The detail that matters is ugly and precise. He didn't hurt any hostage before he went down. Then, one of the commanders barked out a question in Hebrew, asking where the others were. The hostages, half flattened by terror and noise, indicated the way. They pointed toward the main hall. A door, a gesture, a few seconds. Grenades went in first. Then the commandos entered, and the last 3 hijackers died there. That is how thin the line was. Not a grand speech, not a duel, just a pointed finger and a blast wave. Men moving through dust before the echo had even settled. Outside, the operation was already widening. Transports were unloading armored vehicles to cover the field. They did this while the planes were refueled. Other teams were blowing up Ugandan jets on the ground, so there would be no pursuit after takeoff. Another sweep moved across the airfield gathering intelligence, whatever could still be grabbed in the middle of chaos. So when people remember Entebbe as one clean heroic strike, that is only half true. It was a rescue, nested inside a larger act of violent paralysis. Kill the hijackers, suppress the army, cripple the airbase. Leave before the state can wake up and hit back. And then came the price tag, because there is always a price tag. As the hostages were being loaded, soldiers opened fire from the tower. The Israelis answered with machine gun bursts and a rocket, hammering the tower until the return fire died down. But not before men were hit, 5 wounded, 1 dead. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Netanyahu Yoni, the assault commander, the name that keeps surviving the decades. Because every daring operation condenses into a single human cost. You can almost feel the emotional whiplash in real time. Rescued hostages stumbling up the ramp, engines screaming, adrenaline peaking. And somewhere in the same minute, the officer's body is no longer moving. So yes, the mission was a success. Brutally, unmistakably, historically a success. 102 hostages rescued, all hijackers dead, dozens of soldiers killed, fighter jets destroyed on the tarmac. The flight crew later honored for staying with their passengers, when they could have just walked away. Those are the facts people polish into legend. But the darker truth sits underneath them. The operation didn't end when the planes lifted off. It simply moved the violence onto whoever was left within reach. That is the twist, hidden inside the applause. The hostages were never the only vulnerable bodies in the story. Once Amin learned Kenya had helped the mission, his rage took over, doing what dictatorship always does when humiliated in public. It turned outward and downward, onto people who couldn't shoot back. Kenyan civilians in Uganda paid for a decision they didn't make. Hundreds were murdered, and thousands fled. Solders inside Uganda were arrested merely for the suspicion of cooperation. Suspicion, not proof. They were taken to barracks. 12 were shot by Amin himself with a pistol. That image matters because it strips away the theater. No podium, no ideology, just a ruler and a handgun, and the petty intimacy of revenge. Even the officers tied to Entebbe were living by accident, not justice. One base commander reportedly survived because he left his post early to meet a woman at a hotel. Think about that. Whole chains of military accountability collapsed, not because of strategy, but because one man had a date. In another timeline, he is present, blamed, and executed. In this one, personal friendship keeps him breathing. History likes to dress itself as inevitability. Most of the time it is held together by lateness, vanity, and lust. Just temper and dumb luck. And then there is the detail that stains the whole episode, past redemption. Dora Block, elderly, sick, the raid saved lives.